Awesome. Just I did it.
Okay, wonderful. So now we're on recording aspect. So whatever I say from now on, oh dear. Okay, I have to be on my best behavior. All right.
We'll only see it. You're good.
What can I do to help you? You had a number of great questions, so let's get started.
Yeah, Lauren, did you want to start or did you want me to start?
I can start. I have them all written out. So the first one's pretty basic. It's just what is your title, job description, and your role with your place of appointment or employment. I know you work at the University of Florida.
Well, yeah, I am currently a professor for the Florida State University Graduate Art Therapy Program. I'm pleased to say I'm no longer chair of the department. I was chair of the Department of Art Education for 10 years, and 2 years ago I stepped down. But nature abhors a vacuum, or I should say academic life abhors a vacuum. And in that time, I've since also become the new, well, relatively new project coordinator, project developer and coordinator of the Florida State University and Florida Department of Corrections Art Therapy in Prisons program. So I oversee that new system. And so technically I've got two roles, but they're all folded into my capacity as professor for the art therapy program.
So, I'm gonna change this question a little bit. It was originally how long have you been in this position, but how long have you been in like art therapy and corrections just in general?
In general, 30 years. So I've been an art therapist for it'll be, yeah, it'll be 30 years this August. I've been an art therapist since I graduated. And in that time, I immediately began, upon graduation, working in the correctional system in Northern California. I will say there were a couple of years I tried to pull away and get out of corrections because it is quite overwhelming sometimes and can be exhausting, right? And you get burned out. But you try to get out and they pull you back in. And so I've tried to stay out of correction. Here's a story that came up. I don't know if you had an opportunity to see any. Did you either of you ever read the last book that came out, Art and Art Therapy with the Imprisoned? Well, there's a little anecdote in the beginning where I talk about a colleague. She's actually the provost of the university, but before she was the provost, she was actually the chair of the Department of Art Education. And when I left Kansas to come here 20 years ago to start teaching, and I was in Kansas as a professor in Emporia State after I left Northern California from the prisons, she sat me down. She was the chair of the department. She said, Dave, you're now a professor here at Florida State. It's a research-oriented institution. What are your research interests? And I was like, well, okay. And I gave a 25-minute synopsis of what my dissertation was about and looking at the role of the art therapist and theory and practice and yada, yada, yada. And she said, yeah, that's great. But what about that art therapy and prison stuff? Now that's sexy. I'm like, well, how do you say no to that? So, and I understand what her perspective was. And I question that sometimes, especially since then, 20 years later, but I think there's something to that. And so even here, once I connected with her, I found myself back in correctional environments. So there was a couple of years that I tried to get away from it. But over the 30 years, I would say the majority of those years have been involved with corrections. It's a really long answer. I should have just given you like a number, right?
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
How I'm gonna go off topic real quick. Like,
Yeah,
how
of course.
personally have you like dealt with the burnout? Because I know that's hard for a lot of people, specifically in psychology and even in the criminal justice field.
Well, sense of humor helps a great deal. And finding a cohort of people who understand. There's not a lot of art therapists out there in corrections. There are a lot more now than there were certainly 30 years ago. And so, and being able, here's where it really started to make a difference, is that for a number of years, I started wondering if what we're doing is effective. Is it making change? Is it really working? Because you're neck deep in it. All of these day-to-day activities are drawing on you. You've got all these struggles and these frustrations inside an institution like this. And it wasn't until 94, a few years later, where I was in a position to present at the national conference on the prison work. And ever since 94, I've been presenting almost every year in some capacity on some of this work. And then in 95, I got approached by the editor of Magnolia Street Publishing to do what came out in 97, Drawing Time, art therapy in prisons or the correctional settings. And the reason I bring that up is because that writing about it, presenting about it, forced me to look back on the work that was done and seeing the changes that were made by some of the people I work with. Because when you're in the middle of it, you don't see much change. But when you actually reflect back on it after time, when you have time for reflective distancing, all of a sudden you're like, well, look at that. We are making a difference. And change does occur. I was just talking about that with my colleague who she's the art therapist in the art therapy in prisons program. And she's fascinated because we were going over a case that she's been working on in which change occurred. And it was the same thing is that we forced ourselves to look back on it because we're writing about this. And she realizes, look what we're doing. So that helps alleviate, mitigate some of the burnout. But then a lot of it is really learning how to compartmentalize and really seeing the funny side of everything, because everything is funny. And a sense of humor does get us through this, but it's important that we have the type of sense of humor that serves us well instead of the Schadenfreude, which a lot of officers and people who have been in the system for many, many years express and experience, where it's this gallows humor. And I think that doesn't do anything to help us. But we see different ways to respond. The other part of that, of course, is not only do I write about it, but I do artwork as well, as much as I can, which isn't as much as I'd like. But every now and then I'll do some reflection and use some of my own art to do that. Yeah. So that's an excellent question. And I'm glad you went off topic. I hope you do more of that because it makes it so much more exciting. So
Okay.
yeah.
And then going back onto somewhat topic is what kind of trainings and like education have you done to
None.
get to where you're at? Yeah, I wish it could be like that.
Well, I had a bachelor's degree in California. I was an art student, and I had worked with gang members as a volunteer, and then through a psych unit that I worked at during my undergraduate years, the later couple of years. So I worked with aggressive and violent adolescents and gang members, and then I went to graduate school for my master's degree. And after that, I was able to find a position in a prison in Northern California. It's the only training I needed was the art therapy degree. But then getting my doctorate allowed me to recognize how to formulate and develop different research agendas in which to examine that work. And then my position as a faculty member has given me the freedom to really explore it much more in depth. I have not, because when I did this, it was unheard of really, or maybe it was heard of and I just wasn't listening. But this idea that art therapists can go back in and get criminology certificates, or now I teach or I'm a guest lecturer in various criminology groups and certificates and training seminars for correctional officers and officers. And I don't even think about the fact that I never really got a certificate in anything other than the degree in my art therapy degree. So I think it behooves us to get that additional experience as a forensic art therapist, or the certificates that are out there, like what Marcia Sue Cohen-Liebman does, or other criminology opportunities, but just never did that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we know that you work at FSU and for the Florida Department of Corrections. Tell us about like where you work and like what clients you serve, if any.
Well, and right now I don't serve the clients directly, and I don't work for Florida Department of Corrections. It's what it is, and I'm really excited about this because it's the first one of its kind, where we actually have a formal contract between Florida State University and Florida Department of Corrections to institute the FSU/FDC Art Therapy in Prisons program. And so the art therapists that are hired through this program, they are hired by FSU, but we're contracted out by FDC to provide these services.
Okay.
And so I don't technically work for FDC. I consult with them, so to speak. I am under a different umbrella. But I don't necessarily see clients. I had a private practice for a number of years before I became chair of the Department of Art Education. I had a practice for 5 years where I specialized in working with aggressive and violent clients, or what other people in town thought were violent and aggressive. They really weren't. They were just behaviors that the other therapists couldn't really work with. And I loved it. So I had that practice for about 5 years, then was an administrator while also teaching and a professor. And then the past couple of years, I oversee the art therapists that are working specifically with youthful offenders. So they're still in the prisons. They're in 4 prisons, and will be in 4 other prisons in which there are certain inmate category here in Florida that's designated youthful offenders, where they're not in juvenile justice because of the crimes that they've committed are a lot more serious. So they'll be put in the prisons, but they're in special units. And so we work with men and women who are still going through their educational program, because our funding is through IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And that allows us to address a number of the barriers that are preventing them from being able to receive their education, receive a GED, but also allows us to deal with certain mental health issues, deal with locus of control and anger management and identity formation. And so right now, we're not dealing with anyone older than 23 or 24, nobody younger than 16, but they are the prison population. I go and do site observations and I'll help consult, but for the most part, the art therapists who I meet with on a weekly basis, they're boots on the ground.
Gotcha. That makes sense. That kind of, you sort of started to answer kind of our next question, which would just be to describe what a typical day of work looks like for you.
Oh, I don't work.
I mean, it could change for you like, all the time, which I feel like we're getting towards. But
your job, it doesn't feel like work.
yeah,
Well, that's it. Boy, I'm an art therapist, and for 30 years, I wake up in the morning and say, God, I can't believe they pay me to do this. I mean, granted, there are days that I'm like, they pay me to do this, but for the most part, yeah, I mean, it's challenging and it could be overwhelming at times. And so for me to describe my day of work, I think you're right, Lily. I think there's a certain difficulty in being able to address that because of how much it changes. But if I was an art therapist inside those prisons, it starts from the minute you show up at the gate and you have to go through all those checkpoints and searches and sally ports before you actually get to your office. And then it involves so much negotiation to get those inmates taken out of their dorms and out of their cells and into your individual session or group session, and going through escort and movement so that they can then be transported over to where you are. And it's so much backstage machinations and negotiations that have to occur to make it work. So much of the work involves understanding the system and how do we fit within that system, provided that we're recognizing ourselves as an ambassador into a cultural environment that we're not exactly prepared for. So how do we learn the lessons? And that doesn't mean just the staff and the officers, probably more importantly, recognizing the subculture of the prison population and how do we fit in with that, knowing full well how we might be viewed from the outside and how do we then negotiate that. So a lot of it is really just a lot of informal connections, trying to smooth the way for when we do the formal sessions. It's a lot of, a lot of the things that don't get documented.
With how you said like getting used to the subculture and everything, have you personally like noticed between like your art therapist like a bias, or like I don't know exactly how to explain it, with like people working with women art therapists compared to men art therapists? Like, are they more willing to work with one, or are they pretty open with both? Because I know with like female offenders usually don't like working with female professionals.
Well, I mean, one of our populations is a women's prison, and the art therapist is doing a fantastic job there. And she was also an art therapist in a prison in Virginia. She graduated from the program here after interning at the prison, went up to a women's prison in Virginia, did amazing work there. Casey Barlow, and I bring up her name because she and I did a chapter together for Nora Swan Foster's book on pregnancy issues. And she talked about working with inmates who are pregnant. And so she did great work. She's highly valued where she is now with the women's population, the women's prison. Look, I think ultimately it's the recognition that we're in there to help them and work with them and see them as real people, as opposed to the numbers that they're given and the uniforms that they're wearing. And once that breakthrough occurs, that gets spread around pretty quickly. And once that happens, yeah, there's going to be people that don't like that, and maybe try to pressure you or to manipulate you, or throw a chair at you, if you will, and that is painful. But but for the most part, they do recognize what our role is, and so they're willing to let us in, so to speak.
Awesome. Yeah, I always hear different like point of views, so like I always want to make sure to like always get that in.
Yeah, I do think that there is a belief or a myth that women therapists do better than men therapists in a men's prison, and that male therapists do better in a women's prison than women do because of the dynamics. And I don't think that's true. I think that's certainly there's going to be some, depending on the gender biases and the baggage that I carry as a white privileged man, and recognizing what my role is in that, and having to know that I'm going to broadcast that I'm there to listen and to hear who they are, and meet them where they are. That changes the dynamics considerably. And so um, I know that those thoughts are out there, and I used to say that too because it was shorthand. But I think it's a lot more complicated than that. Yeah.
See. Okay. And then one of our questions is, what is the most fulfilling aspect that you have with your work? I know it's hard probably to pick one.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's been so many years. I think it's not necessarily the client contact, but it's seeing a real expansion of the acceptance of art therapists working in prison populations and correctional populations. Real, when I first began this, and I think my first focus group, I was invited to do the forensic art therapy focus group back in '96, and there may have been 15 or 20 people there, and only a couple of us were working in prisons. Many of them were working in court ordered, hospitals and state facilities and with locked units. And now I go do a conference, and I think one of the last forensic art therapy master supervision sessions I held, there were 65, 70 people in there. I mean, and they were bona fide working within these environments. And so that's so fulfilling to see how much more art therapists are out there, and getting a chance to pass the baton, because quite frankly, people are getting sick of seeing Gussak's name attached to this. And there's art therapists out there that's doing a much better job. And so I'm working with a number of younger art therapists to get their writing out there and to co-author things. And so it's so fulfilling to see how this is not only being accepted, being spread, because there's, like I said, better art therapists out there than me. And I think they're the ones that should be heard. And so it's kind of exciting, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It
Yeah.
does.
So, kind of on the flip side of that, and I'm going to apologize to Lauren because I'm going to kind of tie two questions together here, but
Well,
um, so we have one question, which is what are some challenges you face in your work?
all of them.
And then another question, so that one could be like personal, but then another question would be, has there been any opposition to art therapy and corrections? Which I feel like you sort of touched on already by saying that, there used to be very little art therapy and corrections and now there's more.
Well,
So
there's going to be, okay, so the challenges are, and one of the things that we recognized was, where does the art therapist fit in? And you drop us, and I've written about this in so many different avenues, so I'm just going to try and provide a synopsis here. And I wrote about this first in '97 and revisited it again in 2019, which is recognizing the identity of the art therapist and who are we, and dropping us into the middle of a very primitive pre-Oedipal, if you want to be psychoanalytic, not that I would, but a very primitive us versus them environment. And I wear neither green nor blue. So where do I fit in? And so it's trying to negotiate that relationship so that I can work with both sides within this environment, recognizing um, that there's one of three things that can happen. One is that you side with either side because you see more value in the correctional environment, because you believe that eventually you're so beaten down that nobody deserves what they have coming to them, and you become overly punitive, and that they're in there for a reason. And so you develop this over correctional mentality. And I had a colleague who became a correctional officer because she really adopted that perspective. Then there's the side where you become overly empathic for the correctional inmate who can manipulate that and can take advantage of that. And I've had a couple of colleagues that were walked out because they over empathized with the inmates, and then they gave them gifts or they did something that was inappropriate, and that's breaking the rules. So you can end up siding with either side, which is useless for the work that you're doing. One is that you can become so scared of either side that you become impotent and do nothing except do your 40 hours a week, get out the gate, and retire 25 years later, making no difference whatsoever. But the other one, the third one, is you can learn how to compromise. And that sounds simple, but it really is quite difficult because you have to be able to compromise without either side seeing that that's what you're doing. So you have to be able to work with both sides, and both of them thinking that you're with them and that you're siding with them and you're there for them without either side suspecting the other. And the great thing is we're art therapists. We have that secret weapon that lets us negotiate that and show acceptance by accepting their artwork of the inmate population, and showing the officers that will respect the rules that they have by providing limited materials, or working within the system to provide um, structured activities. And both sides see that you're there to help them, and ultimately we're there to make it a much safer environment. So the challenge is recognizing where you fit within this dynamic. Another major challenge, and I wrote about this in one of the chapters, because I have an issue with people out there writing about things, and all they do is show the wonderful glorified things that we do, and no one's willing to write about their mistakes. And yet I've made many mistakes. And one of the mistakes was finding myself at the crossroads of ethics, morality, and legality, and having to negotiate that intersection. And oftentimes, particularly in a prison environment where legality rules the roost, that may force me in a position to either violate my ethics and certainly my morals. And so how do you negotiate that on a regular basis? And it can be quite overwhelming. So that's a challenge. um, the opposition is always going to be that they just don't understand what we're there for. Are we pampering a population that has nothing coming, that deserves nothing coming to them? Are we giving them treats and giving them play time when they should be punished? And it's a matter of really educating the environments that we're in to say, look, part of our role is to create a safer place, a safer environment for all of you, and also for you know, that there is something quite valuable in this. But art therapy being what it is, some of the other mental health staff will suspect what you're doing because they don't think that what you're doing is all that worthwhile either. And so it's really demonstrating how do we work as a team. I will say it's a lot better now than it's ever been. And I will say it's probably because we've done some outcome measures and we've shown some research that shows its benefits. And now a lot of the prisons want us in there. That's kind of nice. Nice to be wanted, isn't it?
Yes. Well, what's crazy to me is like when I first started about art therapy and corrections, I was watching a documentary a few years ago about it starting in California. Like I think it was pretty much Northern California, and like how it was slowly moving because it wasn't such a big thing. And I was like, wow, this is crazy. From just like looking back to that and doing all the research now on it, I'm like, whoa, things have really changed.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Northern California back in the 90s. And what they were also referring to is not only art therapy, but it was arts and corrections, which was run by the AIC group. I'm trying to remember some of the names. Cleveland was a part of that. There were some great people that really ran the arts and corrections. And so when I say that we're the first program of its kind, it's the first program of art therapy program in a state university working with the Department of Corrections. But there've been other states where arts facilitators in conjunction with universities have worked with prisons. And in California was the first host to arts and corrections. And then later, our therapists were hired as rehabilitation therapists. Those were our titles. And that's how I got to the door. Yeah.
Cool. So we've learned about trauma informed care,
Mhm.
and we wanted to know what your thoughts, or have you personally encountered about it? Like, what do you think on it?
But trauma informed care.
Yes.
My understanding and recognition of trauma work comes mostly through the work of Linda Gant from the Trauma Institute. And so I've never actually taken formal training in trauma informed care, but I've learned through her work of the Trauma Institute and how art therapy can help facilitate that. Having said that, recognizing that many of the people that we work with inside have their own traumatic experiences, which many of them do. I won't say they all do, but many of them do. And that's what led them there in the first place. And so, whether I'm aware of the trauma work I was doing or not, we certainly were doing it. Um, since then, there's been a lot of wonderful theorists out there and clinicians who have been really taking a trauma informed approach and trauma informed theoretical orientations that they teach. I'll still always fall back to Linda Gant and the Trauma Institute and the work that she does.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll have to like look at some of her work
Oh, she's great.
afterwards.
Yeah.
It's Gant. She's actually also the one who developed the feats. She was also my professor back in '90,
Oh,
and
that's
she's still around, and she and I remain very close friends. She's
Oh,
great.
that's awesome.
Yeah, she's great.
okay. What advice do you have for college students, I think specifically undergrad students who want to be helping professionals, like, I don't know, the field in general or even like just personally, professionally?
Yeah, I recognize at first that you do this for the love of the work that you're doing, and that you're not doing this for the money. The money may come. Many of us and all of us have made a living out of this. But that's not why we go into this, because there may not be a whole lot. You have to be tenacious. You have to learn how to sell yourself and know how to market yourself and position yourself. And recognize that a graduate program is infinitely more difficult than an undergraduate program. And that if you're committing to it, you're throwing yourself in 100%. And then you've got to find the right fit for a graduate program. We're in a good position that we've got about 35 to 40 really strong art therapy programs out there. Now, there's only a couple out there that are state universities. And so, like Florida State, it is relatively inexpensive, but also consider the location. I mean, you're in Ohio, you have an excellent program right there in Ursuline, which is great. Yeah, I was just up there a couple of years ago doing a gig for them. It was wonderful. They're good. And so, but if you want to go elsewhere, there's places all over. You find the right fit, and then you marry that fit, because you're going to be wanting to divorce it before the next 2 or 3 years are over. And then you've got to be creative and hold on to the art. Don't lose sight of that. And then once that happens, then you've got to figure out a way to get involved with the field, get involved with the association, make yourself heard, make the changes that need to happen. You got to push old people like me aside and start making the changes that need to occur, because you don't want to hear from me anymore. You want to make your own changes.
How, as you say, old people, how do you think we can push them though? Because I know a lot of people don't want to be pushed. Because I work in public safety right now for a university, and I just throw out some like ideas, possible changes that we can do. I know I'm on the bottom of the totem pole compared to everyone, but they get so offended when I throw out ideas.
Oh, I wish I can answer that. I think you got to recognize where that's coming from, so that you continue to throw out the ideas and not fear that and not take it personally when they react that way. And I'm not saying that their utter disregard is disrespectful, and that shouldn't be tolerated. But one method is, of course, establishing the relationships on an individual basis with them, and you speak with them ahead of time before such meetings, so that it's not a complete surprise when you throw out these new ideas, and all of a sudden they're like, "Well, we'll support these," or you set it up in such a way that you allow them to think it's their idea, because there's some egos involved. But then there's a lot of art therapists out there at my level, and there's a lot of us who are like, we're learning a lot from the art therapists that are coming behind us, which in and of itself sounds a little arrogant and condescending to say that, and I apologize, because the reality is all of us are going to learn from each other, um, and so it really is a matter of working as part of the team and recognizing that an ideal team is somebody with the experience, working with somebody with the energy and new ideas, and see it at a level that perhaps we can't see it, and figure out how do we work together as a group and as a committee. And so I do think it's perhaps saying pushing us out of the way is a little too um, simplistic. It maybe is a matter of figuring out ways to be heard and be part of the group and make sure that, when your ideas are said over and over and over again, um, eventually it'll be heard. Unfortunately, given the tone and the um, prejudice and biases and sexism that exists in this world, you're going to have to work a lot harder than me. I'm not going to simply apologize for that, but some of us are trying to make a change to that. Now you're going into a field that's primarily women, and that's great because it's a place you could be heard and be seen. Um, but don't let that change how you might be seen by the other groups. You just have to kick some ass.
That's what my mom always tells me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like another hard one that I'm putting on you since I know it's hard to pick one thing.
Okay.
But what has been one of your favorite or a few favorites experience that you've dealt with your clients when you did do it, or helping some of your art therapists work with their clients?
What are some of the best experiences?
Yes.
Oh, there's a number of them. One is, of course, when we had for a while the inmate murals arts program out here. Dr. Laura Bedard became the deputy secretary of the Department of Corrections. She used to be a professor of criminology, became the deputy secretary, and she wanted to bring the arts into correctional arena. And so she put together a team. I was included on this team to develop a white paper on the value of the arts in corrections throughout Florida. That didn't really go anywhere, but an offshoot of that was the inmate mural arts program. And that lasted for a few years, in which, depending on the year, I would work closely with two art therapists, either students or recent graduates, and we would work inside the institutions, or at one point took the inmates out from a jail setting into the community, and we did large mural projects. If you're interested, there's an article about that very experience of the first mural from that, and that was done by, you know what, I'll send it to you right now.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. First, let me find your email here so I can just attach it. And there you are. All right, so what I'm going to do is attach this, and there's a blog post on it, and then there's because I don't know if you know this, and no reason why you should. I had for 3 years after my Art on Trial came out, I ended up doing a blog with Psychology Today for 3 years called Art on Trial: Confessions of a Serial Art Therapist. And there I would write about my experience as a expert witness for a death row case, and then that merged into my work with forensics. And so there was around 53 different articles or blog posts, and there's 3 or 4 of them that each delineate each of these mural projects. But that before it was this article here called Transformation Through Negotiation, and that was about the first prison mural program. The mural was amazing, and it was quite an extensive project. So that was probably one of my most memorable. But there's so many directives that we've done that have been successful, and some very simple ones. There's just been extraordinary, So yeah, there's that.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. We're getting towards the end here. One of our last questions has to do with like support and funding, which I know in academia and research is always the big elephant in the room, but is it any harder in art therapy specifically, like as opposed to the entire field of corrections and psychology, to get support and funding?
I don't know. It's a good question. The fact that we have our program funded through the IDEA grant, and it's a very generous grant, and it's multi-year. And after the grant goes away, we're going to continue the program funded through the Department of Corrections because of its success. These are art therapists that are getting paid, $50,000 a year plus full benefits, and we have a very generous budget for the materials and generous budget for the technology that we need and travel budget so they can present at conferences. So, and that was a 3-year contract, and we're getting set to renegotiate it to extend it for another 3 years with the 2 more art therapists. So we found the funding. Now it took me a long time, and I had to work with somebody in Department of Corrections who kind of sponsored it, and I worked with him. It's just we have to be very creative on how we find it. There are some prisons that are already hiring clinicians, counselors, and psychologists and therapists, that if an art therapist is licensed in a particular state as a counselor, and they can get hired by a correctional system to provide those services and then convince them to allow you to use the art. There are certain states that will actually hire art therapists under already designated titles, such as rehabilitation therapists, mental health practitioners. The problem with that is, of course, your title is an art therapist, and you may not always be allowed to do art. The other value of this program out here is one of the stipulations with developing this contract was making sure that art therapists were designated as art therapists, and that was their scope. And I had built into the contract what their scope was. And so that was exciting. And so there's some funding out there, some options, some short-term projects that can be sought after. I think that's the only way I can say that, Oh,
That answers it. Thank you.
sure, you're welcome. I could be more vague. Can I be more vague?
I mean, always try. Does that hurt?
That's what I work for.
And then, so this is our final question that we had. What is the single most important aspect of your work?
The single most important aspect of my work is recognizing who they are inside. Look, there's a reason they're in prison. Many of them deserve to be in prison to go through a rehabilitation process, but we can't forget that they're real people, that they're part of an institution that marginalizes and dehumanizes them and objectifies them. And the most important aspect is for me to do my best to try and reverse that and create new labels. And that's sometimes the most important and valuable thing, is simply to accept an art piece from someone, because that's an extension of who they are. And by accepting the art piece, you're accepting who they are. And we place value in that. And holding on to setting the bar extremely low, knowing that whatever little thing that we do can be a huge impact, a ripple effect for them that we're not aware of. And keeping your sense of humor. God, that's so important.
Always.
Sorry, I was just writing everything down. Thank you for all this stuff.
I hope you find it helpful.
Side question. Sorry, I keep doing these. I know you said you like them, but I still feel bad.
That's fine.
So with like the whole rehabilitation and corrections, do you think we are making progress even though it's slowly happening? Or do you think we may be stuck?
Oh, we're never going to be stuck. We're always going to be on a pendulum. And it always takes a lawsuit, a death, a movement that will start moving the pendulum the other way. It was up until the 20s and 30s where prisons were an abomination, and inmates were nothing more than wards of the state that, unless they had somebody on the outside who could support them, they got nothing, because they were cash cows for many stockholders. The Quaker movement came through, and then patients' rights and inmate rights came through, and then all of a sudden people started going through what was called the rehabilitation phase, when you realize that one of the things we can do inside is start rehabilitating. Of course, we're rehabilitating based on what we think is correct, which isn't always correct. I mean, it's still an institution that was developed by white privilege, right? I mean, the numbers are so unfair inside. It was just a really another way for us to continue, sort of, to a certain extent, free slavery, because now we can use those services or those inside and pay them, very little to do the work. But back in the 50s and 60s, early 70s, rehabilitation started, and it started going in the right direction. And then during the Reagan years, where decentralization and deregulation kicked in, and all of a sudden the environments become much more punitive. And once again, that they were housing cells to keep people away from society rather than recognizing them as a part of society. That continued for quite a while. Lawsuits in the 90s and the 2000s brought more care inside, and so more programming had to be developed. Some of that was just lip service, depending on the state that you're in. Some of it was genuine services. Um, I, I do think that it's very difficult for us to change the mindset of a nation, and that's what needs to happen for us to really start to recognize how rehabilitation could really happen inside. Because once you gain a sense of real identity with them, then we could do everything we can to reduce recidivism, much more humane practice of the types of crimes. I mean, things that we label crimes are so crazy. And, in the 80s, all the way up till now, the mentally ill are becoming criminalized, and it's easier to house them in prison than it is to build more hospitals for people who can care for them. And so we're slowly making strides, and perhaps in pockets, but it takes a great movement, a macro movement at the upper echelon, the major societal change shift for us to start recognizing what prisons could be instead of what they are. It's a very cynical response, but within that cynicism, I do think that we have opportunities that we've been working.
I definitely agree. Well, Lily, do you have any other questions, or Dave, do you have any questions for us?
No. So what's your plan after this? And you're going through your undergraduate degree. You're getting the certificate in criminology. You'll be pursuing a master's in art therapy, I'm assuming.
So I know me personally, I'm stuck between art therapy or just doing my social work master's.
Okay.
I really want to do art therapy, but I don't know. I've been trying to do research or I'm from Columbus, Ohio, so I've been like looking at there, and it's just things are so sticky when I'm looking at it. So they're like, I don't know. It's a work in progress. I'm taking a gap year to work, save
Good.
money. So
It's smart.
yeah, hopefully I will continue to work with University of Cincinnati after I graduate. I'm a student worker right now, so I'll probably stick with being in public safety for a few more years, because then they can help me pay for college and then
Well, that's smart. That's really smart.
Yeah.
Is that what you're going to do, Lily? Is that
I'm actually kind of going a different route. I right now am on a research team that looks at kind of like gender differences in the criminal justice system. So I could definitely see myself doing something with art therapy down the road. But my plans right now are to go for a clinical psych PhD program,
good?
which is aiming big. I don't know how I feel about another 6 years of school, but
6 years from now, you're going to look back on that and say, look, I just lived 6 years and I could have gotten a doctorate out of this.
yeah, that's exactly right. So I do think that that's what I'm working towards, but I guess I have 6 or 7 months to decide, because then I'll have to apply. But
Or 50 years, because you can always decide after a couple of years. I didn't go back for my doctorate I was in the field for about 10 years.
okay. Yeah, I know there's a lot of people, there's a couple people on my research team who are, in their like 30s and 40s. So
It's
it
so
definitely, it can be done however you want to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. But it sounds like you guys want to help make a difference inside the prisons, which is good.
Yeah.
Do yourself a favor and just self-regulate. Don't let it burn you out. I've been close with many social workers. As a matter of fact, Bill Fox was one of my favorite people. He was a social worker. He and I really did a lot of work together in the early 90s, and he was one of the silent editors for the first book. and it was just such a wonderful team. But it could be grueling, and you have to learn how to really kind of focus on what you need. So take care of yourselves when you're doing it.
Yeah, that I was on a research team with white collar offenders, and my mentor, she was telling me, she's like, it's so draining, like talking to them, because she's like, I'm just here to listen to their story. I can't do anything about it but study them and publish the work. And she's like, that's what kills me. But she's like, just remember, like what you were telling us, like look at the change that you're making, like
Mhm.
just think at that and you can go far.
Absolutely, she's smart. Excellent. Well, this was a pleasure. I enjoyed talking with both of you, and again, I apologize for missing that first meeting. Give Jennifer my best, and good luck.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Let me know if along the way you need some more information or any other help, and I'll do my best.
Awesome. Thank you for everything.
You're
Yeah,
very
thank
welcome.
you.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye.